Good morning. My name is Sam Harris. I'm President Emeritus of the Illinois Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I'm happy to be with all of you today to tell you my story. So here goes. Um, Winston Churchill said of the Holocaust, "There is no doubt that this is probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world." End of quote. I'm going to share just a few things that illustrate Mr. Churchill's statement. I'll tell you of a little boy called Sammy, who from age 4 to age 9.5, and witnessed some of those terrible horrors. You see, before World War II, my little hometown of Deblin, Poland, located at about 50 miles south of Warsaw, Poland, was a peaceful village. I was the youngest of 7 children, 2 brothers, 4 sisters. My father was a very religious man. He was a soifer, a scribe, who wrote the Torah by hand with a white quill. If I close my eyes, I can still picture him. He was a tall man with a long black beard and often stayed by an open window for many hours bent over his work. My mother was a short, beautiful woman, a homemaker devoted to her children, husband, and the Jewish community. I remember going for a long walk with my father on the Sabbath. My father would take me to the mikvah, Jewish ritual bath. I would go to the temple and pray with him on Friday. The family went by horse and buggy to my grandparents' farm in a nearby little town called Cholna, where my sister Sarah and I would play with the ducks down by a little pond. My grandfather always had a pony ready for for myself and my sister. My grandmother would bake challah bread. The aroma of the baking of the challah filled the air and smelled so good. I can smell it yet today. You know, life was beautiful. I was a very happy child. All of that changed. It changed on September 1, 1939. My wonderful life was ripped apart. It started out like every other day. We were sitting around the table eating lunch when we heard terrible noises. We ran out. The noise was coming from the sky. Deblin was the location of the Polish Air Force, and the Germans were attacking the airfield. World War II had come to Poland. German airplanes started to fly close to the ground. They began shooting at the people below. We lay on the ground, trying to avoid the rain of bullets. I saw some of my neighbors bleeding. Some died. That was the beginning. It wasn't long before we heard more noises. The ground began to shake. Tanks, trucks, and motorcycles began rolling through the town. I remember how they kicked up much dust on the unpaved street. Next thing I remember were the German soldiers walking through the street wearing helmets and carrying guns with bayonets. I saw them hit the Jews with bayoneted rifles. I remember one old bearded Jew kneeling on the ground, bleeding from his forehead and pleading for his life. The soldiers began the daily routine of rounding up the Jewish men and marching them off to work. Many of them would not return at the end of the day. The Germans quickly made themselves at home. They took what they wanted. If they didn't like the looks of someone, they beat him or shot him. They often beat the Jews for sport. Jews, like my father, who stood out because of this long beard and black clothing, were a favorite target. My father's beard was sheared and pulled many times. I remember one day a soldier came into our house. I was very frightened. There was silence in the room. He asked my father and mother for some tea. My father gave it to him. As the soldier lifted the cup to his mouth, he looked my father in the eyes and without warning threw the boiling hot tea in my father's face. My father was in agony as he rubbed his eyes with his hands. Another time I recall my brother David coming home, crying, sobbing, with my father leaning heavily on him. 4 soldiers had taken my father to the woods. My brother David followed and hid behind a tree, watching helplessly as the soldiers broke sticks from the trees and began beating my father savagely. They continued to beat him until he passed out. Feeling helpless, David could do nothing but cry silently. After the Germans left, David took our father home. I can still see my father lying on the bed with his shirt off. I can still see the bleeding from the soldier's senseless beating. I too began to cry. The Nazis gave an order that all Jews must wear armbands with the Star of David on it. The Jewish portion of Deblin became a ghetto. If any Jews left without permission, they were shot. There was a terrible overcrowding. It was very hard to obtain food. People started to get weak. They became skeleton thin with stomachs bloated from lack of food. The streets were filled with people dying from starvation. And I was always so hungry. The elderly, infirm, and handicapped were taken to the woods and shot. The object was to kill the Jews, except those who could work in the concentration camps as slave laborers. I was about 6 years old the day the soldiers came into the ghetto and began rounding up the Jewish people. We were pulled from our homes. We were forced into long lines. Anyone who didn't hurry to obey was shot. Then my father pushed me out of the line and pointed me toward my sister Sarah, who was she was hiding behind a pile of red bricks. Sarah and I saw the soldiers beat and push the Jews until they were marching in the direction of the train station, where empty cattle cars stood waiting for the tracks. Sarah and I watched as our parents, 2 sisters, 2 brothers, many cousins and friends, neighbors were taken away to be gassed. That is the last I saw of them. In my mind, they're still marching. Right before my father pushed me out of the line that would take him and most of my family to the Treblinka death camp, I looked up toward the sky and said to myself, I'll be all right. I'll be all right. I'll make it. It was as though I was speaking to a guardian angel. There were still some Jews left in the ghetto. So there was another transport, the second transport. The Germans suddenly showed up and began to yell and shout. My sister Rosa and Sarah turned, and we began to run. We heard shooting behind us. We ran so fast. I felt as though I was flying. We came to a farm and decided to hide in the outhouse. The farmer saw this, came over, yelled, and kicked us out of the hiding place. We continued to run. In the distance, we saw the German soldiers with their guns and steel helmets jog in single file. As we ran, we saw another barn with a board missing at the top. My sisters pushed me up and I went through the opening above and I landed on inside the barn on a bale of straw. Rosa and Sarah followed. We covered ourselves with the straw. Soon we heard voices yelling in German, Jude heraus, Jude heraus, Jews come out. We were motionless, scared to death. They searched and searched. Eventually, the soldiers left. We were relieved. We waited until it was dark when the shooting stopped before we climbed out of the barn. We walked through the farm fields back to our home and we went to sleep. Early the next morning, I went outside. I saw something terrible. It was a pile of dead bodies, one on top of the other. I noticed a little child moved in the pile. The mother must have fallen on top of her for protection. She was removed from the pile. Her face was full of blood. This was a fearful experience for me, one I still dream about. You see, Deblin had 3 Aussiedlungs. In German, it means evacuations. Then it was Judenfrei, clean of Jews, except for the strong ones who were kept for work as slave laborers in the concentration camp nearby. Jews chosen to work in the concentration camp considered themselves very lucky. If they didn't work there, they could only hide in the woods to escape certain death. My sister Rosa, who was 14 years older than I, was a beautiful young woman, strong, crafty, and a hard worker. She also spoke German. Rosa managed to sneak my sister Sarah and me into the Deblin concentration camp, where we and a few other children were able to hide from the guards. When the Russian army came closer to our concentration camp to liberate us, the Germans decided to force us into cattle cars and to move us to another concentration camp, this time a big city, Czestochowa in Poland. The cattle cars were packed with people, perhaps 75 to 100, no place to move, no toilets. It kind of reminds me as being in the belly of a big monster. After what seemed an eternity, the train stopped and the cattle car doors were suddenly yanked open. We heard all kinds of commotion. Nazis with dogs and whips were yelling, screaming, and hitting Jews with long whips. The German shepherds were barking. It was frightening for a hungry little kid. As my sisters and I came out of the cattle car, down a wooden plank, a German soldier grabbed me by my arm and pulled me away from the grasp of my sister Rosa's left hand. The soldier pushed me to the left and kicked me in my skinny little chest. I do not remember crying. I just remember the shiny boot coming at my little chest. I was placed in a room with 4 other children, about a half a block away from the concentration camp. We were to be taken the next day by truck into the woods to be shot. I learned this was the procedure with all the children who arrived in Czestochowa. Then a miracle happened, and the story follows this way. I was saved by a man called Herman Bankart, a Viennese Jew. It appears that Bankart, the Jewish man, was in the Deblin concentration camp when the Nazi soldier recognized him and hugged him. You see, they both served in the army for the Austrians, the government, during World War I. And then in the battle, Bankart, the Jew, saved his life in the field. He was laying in the valley. The Nazi soldier was wounded badly. Bankart threw him on his back and ran for safety while the bullets were flying all around. I think his name was Brofman, that soldier. Now Bankart needed a favor from this Nazi whom he had saved. Bankart got a letter from the Nazi to save his little daughter, Ruti. She was about my age, maybe a few months younger. When Ruti and I got to the concentration camp, Bankart got out the letter and he showed it to the Nazi. The Nazi in charge was a man by name. Oh, he was a sadist. His name was Bartenschlager. What a name, Bartenschlager. Bankart pleaded to save those 5 children. I was included, who had been placed in the separate room to be killed the next day. At first, Bartenschlager yelled, "No, nein!" After Bankart begged and pleaded to save the 5 children, Bartenschlager yelled, "Deine bleibt," which means yours stays. Then something happened to Bankart. He was silent and he said, "Alle oder keine," save all or none. Bartenschlager stood there puzzled, and he finally screamed that he would let all 5 children go into the concentration camp. But he mustn't be seen. If we're seen, we'll be shot. I and the 4 other children had been saved by Bankart. This was a miracle. I remember entering the camp through a tall, wide, barbed wire gate. Hundreds of Jews were waiting for us. These Jews had the terrible misfortune to having lost their children. Many had not seen a Jewish child years and years. And then they reached out, they kissed and hugged us, the five of us, and handed us from hand to hand like a sacred Torah, on Simchas Torah. I will always cherish those moments of being passed from hand to hand. Once in the camp, I had to hide under blankets and beds. Conditions in the camps were miserable. The lice and fleas, dirt, hunger, and sickness were always present. I remember in the camp, there was an area with lots of barbed wire surrounding it. On the other side of the wires, there was a rail car with potatoes in it. I imagined it was there to feed the prisoners. There were several times when there were no guards around because I was small and skinny. Some prisoners would spread the barbed wires apart. I could sneak and run to the other side where the potatoes were held. I climbed up the ladder on the other side of the rail car and it was filled, and I had an oversized coat. And inside, I filled it with potatoes. You see, the pockets of the coat had holes. Potatoes could go between the lining and the coat. I filled it with so many potatoes that the coat was touching the ground. I walked like a duck. I could hardly walk. I made it back through the barbed wires. It was a celebration time. A tall brick wall was with a long pipe was touching the ground. Very hot steam came out of the pipe. We found some old rusty cans, filled them with water, and put the potatoes into the cans and let the steam cook the potatoes. A great meal. One day, I snuck through the wires, looked around the whole railroad car to see if anyone was watching. And suddenly, what seemed like out of nowhere, I was grabbed by my upper part of the arm. And the Nazi looked me in the eye and pulled out his pistol and put it in front of my eyes. I was shaking. I thought I would die. He was yelling at me, but he didn't shoot me. He let go of my arm. I didn't know what to do. I suddenly turned and began to run. He chased me. I came to a ditch, ran into it, and had a tough time getting out of the other side. Finally, I clawed my way out and continued to run. When I heard no more footsteps behind me, I turned to see what was happening. Apparently the Nazi stopped at the other side of the ditch. He probably decided to let the poor scared little fellow go. What luck. The sky in Czestochowa was lit up with myriads of lights from the battle between the Russians and the German armies. To me, the heavens looked beautiful. Thinking of it now, it was like Disneyland at midnight on New Year's Eve. We were liberated by the Russian army the evening of January 16th and 17th, 1945. It was very cold on January 17th, 1945 in Poland. One of the coldest winters in the land. It was snowing. Rosa, Sarah, Walter, and I started to walk and hitchhike toward our town, Deblin. We were very cold. See, my shoes consisted of rags on my feet bound by string. As we walked along the road, I remember seeing dead Germans and Russian soldiers. There were ruined tanks. I was 9.5 years old. I must have still had a little child in me. I remember climbing up those destroyed tanks pretending to shoot. After a tough journey, we arrived in Deblin. Then there were no other relatives alive from our family. As a matter of fact, we were not even welcome to the town. The townspeople pretty much were saying, what? The Nazis didn't kill me, didn't kill us, and threatened us. So we left. Rosa and her Viennese husband, Walter, decided to continue to go to Vienna, Austria, where Walter was from. They thought it would be best for my sister, Sarah, and me to be staying in an orphanage in Lublin, Poland. Rosa promised that she would come back to get us when they were settled in Vienna. Several months later, Rosa did come back to us. And we went to Vienna. She actually hired a couple of Russian soldiers with a truck. And this is the way we traveled to Vienna, Austria. The truck had oil cans. They took 2 oil cans out from the middle. Sarah and I were hiding in the middle, and we went through Czestochowa and all through the land until we were delivered to Vienna, Austria. In Vienna, I was placed in 2nd grade. I had to learn a new language, German. I learned it quickly because it was similar to Yiddish, Jewish, which was the first language I spoke. When I was 12 years old, an opportunity came for Sarah and me. So in September 1947, we were off on the ship, the Ernie Pyle, to the United States, to the organization of United States Organization of Rehabilitation of European Children. It was partially organized, that organization was partially organized by Eleanor Roosevelt. After 2 weeks in New York, we were sent on a train to Chicago. In Chicago, we were placed in a foster home while the Jewish Children's Bureau was looking for people to adopt Sarah and me. No one family wanted to adopt 2 orphans from the war. It became necessary to split us as we were together for years. I was adopted by one family and Sarah by another. I was adopted by Dr. and Mrs. Harris in Northbrook. And that was in April 10th to be exact, 1948. My name was changed. We changed it to Harris. You see, before that, it was Zhezhnik, Shlamek Zhezhnik. So as of April 10th, 1948, I became Sam Harris. I was placed in 6th grade in April, so I was in 6th grade only a couple of months. And then I graduated. And then I went to New Trier High School and in 1954, and then entered Grinnell College in Iowa and graduated in 1958. As a matter of fact, I adopted pretty fast. I learned to play sports, made a lot of friends, and at New Trier High School, uh, I was in all the various activities. I was elected president of my class, and I never told anybody I was from the Holocaust. I learned to speak English just like anybody else. Um, After I graduated Grinnell College, I joined a company known as Equitable Life Assurance Society, and spent my time in management and in sales. I had a successful career. I never liked to speak about my past. Eventually, my rabbi, who was from Austria, we used to get together all the time, and he said, Sam, it's time to talk. A Northwestern University professor by the name of Butts, he wrote a book called The Hopes of the 20th Century. The Rabbi Willie Frankel, he was pretty popular. He's not living anymore. He began to tell me over and over again, Sam, you must talk. Okay. I began to speak to schools, to churches, synagogues, and other institutions. I wrote my book, Sammy, Child Survivor of the Holocaust. It's now in about 7 languages. I also volunteered to be chairman to build the Holocaust Museum and Education Center. I became its president, and now I am serving as president emeritus. You see, I wanted to make sure what Sayantetta said. He said, he was an author, and he said, quote, he who forgets the past is condemned to repeat it in the future. End of quote. We do not want to repeat what Churchill called the most horrible crime in the whole history of the world. And this is why I shared my background with me, particularly now, these very trying times. People are forgetting the past, and I am here to share my background so that people know. Thank you.
Aren't you supposed to say an ending?
I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Hi, Sam. Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions.
Sure.
Our first one comes from Courtney. She's asked, how did you meet your wife, and what marriage and family advice do you have?
It's easy. I mentioned to you I was working in a company called Equitable Life, and there was a fellow by the name of Cal Cantor. We got to be friends, and I went to a party, and I met his wife, Carol. And the two of them ganged up on me, and they said, we have a sister and sister-in-law that is the greatest lady you'll ever want to see. So we met, and about the 3rd date, I knew she was for me, and I asked her to marry me and to promise me we'd never get a divorce. So now, 59 years later, we have been married, and was the best thing in the world for me. My advice is to be as lucky as me and to find somebody like Dee Dee, and to live together, to live in each other's lives. Dee Dee has helped me through my bad dreams, my memories. She learned about my life, and even now she's sitting at my side, listening to me telling you the story.
That's wonderful. Thank you. The next question, do you remember when the Nazis tried to march in Skokie?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I had 2 friends coming to my office, sat by my side, and tell me not to go out. They had fears that I might lose it. I think that I did not personally watch it because they wouldn't let me go. You know, I'm a very peaceful guy, and I don't know what I would have done. Was there was nothing I could do when I was, you know, 9 years old and 7 years old to the Nazis. I might have lost my temper. I don't know, and who knows what I would have done. Yes, I do remember. I'll never forget it, and this is one of the reasons I spoke out.
And a follow up to that one was, have you seen or experienced anti-Semitism since the war?
Yes, yes, I'm very concerned. I read a lot of newspapers. I see the world. I do not like what's going on. The anti-Semitism in the world now is big time, big time. You know, when I was around during the war, the population of the world was only about maybe 4 billion. Now it's 7.6 billion. A lot of people hate Jews that have never met a Jew. So you've got it all over Europe, and people are marching with swastikas. It's terrible. And furthermore, a lot of people now are, if you stop them on the street, they don't even never heard of Auschwitz. They never heard of it. They never heard of the Holocaust. It's absolutely amazing. And if we didn't have the Holocaust Museum where we learn about the Holocaust, we would fall into this situation where, I quote a saying, he who forgets the past is condemned to repeat it in the future. And I fear it's not, there's nothing we can do, I can do about what happened in the past. But all of us listening here today are listening to a true survivor who's lost his whole family. It was a reality. That's why I'm sitting here sharing it with you. It happened. It can happen again. It is happening right now all over the world.
Powerful words. Thank you so much for sharing too. Heidi has asked, when you arrived in the US, were your adoptive parents aware of what you and your family had gone through?
I did not know my adoptive parents. I didn't know who I was going to meet here. The Jewish Children's Bureau were able to find it. But they knew, they read uh, uh, from social workers that I had recorded in New York in the 2 weeks that I was there. That was it. But once I was adopted, I did want to speak about it. I didn't want to speak to them. I had a lot of bad dreams, and my adoptive mother would sit at the edge of the bed with me as I was yelling and screaming, and she was crying with me, but never asked any questions. Never asked any questions. But she knew my background, maybe not entirely as deep as I did. I don't think anybody does. Those things that I went through are hard to explain, but they're for real.
Danny has asked, can you tell us the story of a piece of Torah parchment that you have framed on the wall in your home and how you got it?
Sure. Dee Dee, my wife, and I went back to Europe. I wanted to know a little bit more my history. I went to my town. No, we went to our town, Deblin. And we used to live, and I still remember the address, Kurna 25, 25th of Kulna. And then we went to the town store, and I said, do you have anything at all from that area? And the Polish fellow there, he was the town historian. He kind of looked up at me. He said, yes, right near your house. We just got this piece of parchment in. So he reached and he came out with a piece of Torah. And he says that was right near your house. And we bought it right away. And it was full of holes on the side. They must have used it for the window shade. You know, I had it interpreted by a rabbi. I wanted to know what that little parchment had to say. And unbelievable. It said that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. And I said to myself, oh my gosh, why would somebody put this thing up there? You know, why would somebody put this up there? Maybe they put it up there, you know, for any survivors. They eventually had a place to go to. I don't know. I'm making this part up, but I took that parchment and I framed it, and it's hanging right over my bed. I'm emotionally attached to it. Thanks for asking that question.
Beautiful. Courtney's asked, have you been back to Europe or have you been to Israel?
Yes, I've been back to Europe, to Poland, to Austria, and to my concentration camps. Both of my concentration camps, I showed it all to Didi. But I went back to Vienna, Austria, where my sister ended up living, and she lived in Austria, and I used to visit her from time to time. She died about 6-7 years ago. Rosa, I'm speaking of. We went to Israel several times. It was very, very emotional for me. You see, I spoke several languages. I spoke Yiddish. I spoke Polish. I spoke Russian. I spent a lot of time. The Russians liberated me, and of course fluent German. And when I went to Israel and I met all these people from all over the world, all these languages just kept coming back to me speaking, and I was just in heaven, going back to the wall and going to a place. You see, nobody wanted me as a child. I was dirt. 1.5 million Jewish children were killed. I am one of the few lucky ones. And to go to Israel, to the wall, something that would be our own. The Jewish people had a place to go to. That was so meaningful. It's still very emotional. Israel is very important to me.
We have time for a couple more. Can you share or tell us a bit about your first couple of days in New York?
Oh my gosh. That I lived in New York. All the little kids ended up in one place, and then the person took us around New York. They wanted to show us New York City. Okay, fine. I couldn't speak a word of English. Yeah, well, I did speak 3 words, I should say. They were yes, no, and Coca-Cola. I learned that on the ship. So here we are. This woman is taking us around on the subway, and then I stepped out. It was so crowded. I stepped out. They pushed me out of the subway, and by the time I'm trying to go in, the doors closed, and all the other people took off. And here I'm standing alone. I don't have any money. I can't speak the language. Oh, it was terrible. I got on the next train. And I got off and I looked around, nobody, I kept doing it, nothing happened. Then I decided to go down and look and walk and walk, and it was getting dark. I was scared. I used to stop people and say, sprechen Sie Deutsch? No. Mówisz po polsku? Nie. No. And I went through stopping people and nobody could speak. Now I'm walking and walking and walking. And suddenly somehow the street, I knew I lived perpendicular next to the station. So that much I didn't know. And I looked, and the street looked familiar. I walked up the stairs, walked in. Hello. Nobody even missed me. I was so happy to be back. That was a terrible experience. Yeah, that's what happened to me in New York.
Another question we got is, were your adoptive parents Jewish, and what is your attitude or kind of feelings towards religion and spirituality?
Yes, my parents were Jewish. They immediately put me into the temple to study, to get confirmed, and that was North Shore Congregation of Israel. I was confirmed there. My feeling toward religion, I think, well, you must understand that I come from a very Orthodox Jewish family. My father was a soifer. That's all I knew. I was born in a shtetl. Nobody knows now anymore what a shtetl is. Everything was Jewish. Friday, singing, temple, mikvah, all of that good stuff. And that was the first 4 years of my life, and that stays with you forever. What do I think of religion? I think religion probably kept me alive. If you remember, I was telling you that I was in line with my father. My father pushed me out of the line while the line kept going, and he was taken with the rest of my family to Auschwitz. And while I was in that line, I looked up in the sky and I said to myself, I would be all right. It was as though a guardian angel was talking to me, and it was, and I still. So throughout the book, I kind of believe in religion. I think family, religion, that kept me alive, because without it, how can a child, and I'm speaking of my past, make it through death, hunger, concentration camps, etc., etc., to be here today? Yes, I do believe in religion.
Very powerful answer. One last question. What kind of message or lesson do you want people to take away from hearing your story?
Oh boy, the lesson, that's a good question. You know, as I sit here think about it, I think that we must understand that people are stronger than we think we are, and to have beliefs, to look ahead and not on a daily basis think of or live in the past. You must look ahead. You must have new plans if you can do it. Now, I understand there are a lot of people who survive just like me, and they cannot think, they cannot dream, they can't remember. I am one of the very, very, very lucky people. But basically, people out there, and I give speeches to children, and a professor, not a superintendent came up to me once and he said, Sam, do you know what you're doing? I said, yeah, I'm teaching the Holocaust. He says, no, 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 no. I said, what? I just went through all of this. Now you tell me no, no. He says, Sam, what you are doing, there are a lot of kids who are on drugs. Their parents were divorced. The father just died and so on. And they look at you and they say, if he can do it, so can I. And I got hundreds of letters from kids writing to me saying, Mr. Harris, thank you. If you can do it, so can I. And finally, I was in Arizona and a lady asked me, do you enjoy speaking? I said, no. Then why do you do it? I said, well, I do it because it helps other people. And kids write me letters, if you can do it, so can I. And she said, you know, that's the title of a book. She wrote a book, if you can do it, Mr. Harris, so can I. And she asked me if I had letters. I said, I have thousands of them. Send me the letters. And she put a lot of those letters together. If you can do it, Mr. Harris, so can I. So the message is the human being is strong. And that would be my strong message to all of you.
Thank you so, so much for that wonderful answer and sharing your story. I am going to let you close out and say goodbye to everybody.
Excuse me, excuse me for open to the last.
Oh, okay.
Well, what I wanted to thank you again for tuning in. Join us next Wednesday, October 7th at 10 a.m. to hear the second generation speaker, Sue Spinello, share her father's story of survival. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum Facebook and other social media accounts where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for supporting us during this extraordinary time. Remember, he who forgets the past is condemned to repeat it in the future. Thank you.